I was really debating whether I wanted to make this video because I'm trying to avoid being so negative these days, and I will say that was my approach going into this show as well, in spite of all the vitriol I was seeing online. It was my most anticipated piece of content this year because that's what streaming has done to Hollywood. We don't get art, movies, or shows anymore, all we get is content. See? I've already started with the negativity. I was late watching it because I had seen all the modern audience's choices being lambasted online and the discourse surrounding it was quite negative, but I remembered being so excited for Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, similarly due to the visual aesthetic of the show. Then all the negative stuff came out about the bait and switch, with it being more of a stealth Ramona Flowers show than a Scott Pilgrim show. But when I finally got around to it, a few issues notwithstanding, I had a mostly positive experience watching it. I bring up Scott Pilgrim because I was hearing that this was a Batman show that didn't really focus on Batman but focused on a side female character instead, so I was able to draw the parallels there. Now I'll just mention a couple of things about my personal biases first, but I don't expect this to resonate with a lot of people. I love a good mystery. If the universe of a noir detective story is sufficiently fleshed out with interesting characters and events, I'm willing to go on a 5-episode deviation away from Batman if the stories and characters are compelling. If the game is about Spider-Man, make it about Spider-Man. If the show is about The Flash, make it about The Flash. Now don't bring up my Insomniac Spider-Man 2 complaints here. This is very specific to this genre and time period because I like to explore and spend time in a detective mystery setting. The more you can show me of the world, the happier I am. And that brings me to my first problem with this show. But let's start with a bit of sugar to coat the medicine. As a lot of people have mentioned, the opening credits are amazing, and the visual aesthetic accompanied by the score are quite magnificent. This is my absolute favorite time period and setting in fiction, and when I'm playing video games like LA Noire and Mafia, I just like existing in all the analog glory of those time periods. People are busy comparing this to Batman the Animated Series, but they could not be any more different in my eyes. Besides being set in a relatively similar time period, the Caped Crusader is much more of a hard-boiled detective noir take on Batman, while the animated series was more of an action-adventure. The Caped Crusader relied on a lot of tropes from detective noir stories, arguably to the detriment of the show, but I will get to that. Now with our sugar consumed, let's get to the medicine. I saw a recurring complaint about the show being boring, and I interpreted that as limited action and slow methodical storytelling because I knew Ed Brubaker was involved and he is a masterful crime writer. If you don't read comics at all and you've never heard of Ed Brubaker, you can credit him for inspiring one of the best MCU films in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. This was me still downplaying the criticism and giving the show chances in spite of the prevailing consensus online. Somewhere along the second and third episode, while loving the world and the score and eating up every single establishing shot on screen, oh my goodness, they were so good, I found myself feeling incredibly bored. I may even have fallen asleep and come back to the episode later, and then it dawned on me why I was starting to struggle. To save a lot on time because I don't want to devote much energy to this video, they made a lot of choices with characters which worked to the detriment of the show. Even the most liberal takes I've seen online said that it was just average or meh or a forgettable show, and all that came down to the characters. They were mostly unlikable, uninteresting, or very one-dimensional, and I will name and shame them shortly. On the area of activism, which I cannot fail to mention because it was quite prevalent in the show, they couldn't decide on a consistent approach which was quite immersion breaking for me on one hand and made for a lot of very unlikable characters on the other. They wanted to have a very diverse cast for the time period, but they also wanted to lean on era-specific tropes regarding discrimination because feminism was clearly on focus here with JJ's unfortunate involvement. And I say unfortunate because the recent past has shown how much of a hack he is. Detective Renee Montoya, who felt like the stealth bait-and-switch main focus for the show, was initially very disrespected for being a woman in charge.
But her? You really think the men are gonna take orders from that?
I expect my men to obey the chain of command.
I still can't believe Gordon put her in charge.
But somehow, the other female and even black characters were featured in positions of prominence. Other than the gender-swapped Penguin and the race-swapped Harleen Quinzel and Commissioner Gordon and his daughter Barbara Gordon, and Arnold Flass, who also got the reverse Michael Jackson treatment, and the Penguin's lead henchman and Papa Midnight, all these characters were propped up within their spheres of influence, which made things a little confusing for me. Gordon had to toe the line to make the mayor happy, but all the other race-swapped characters were depicted as more competent and authoritative than those around them. There was also still an undercurrent of sexism with characters like Harvey Dent and Bruce Wayne on occasion, as well as swaths of other side characters.
Sweetie, thank God. I was hoping you'd be here.
Call me that again, and you're gonna lose some teeth.
But they never committed to a decision one way or another on what this era was and what their discriminatory attitudes were based on, which just made for a very confusing experience for me. This was clearly not a racist time, but sexism was still the main problem, I guess. Like, was this supposed to be vaguely historically accurate, or was the time period just set dressing to use the aesthetic of the past but imbue it with modern day politics? If you go back and watch most of the detective noir stories from the age before color, the male characters tended to be stern, flat, and cold by standards of modern cinema, while the ladies were often soft and dainty, which is another example of the show adhering to one trope of detective noir cinema, but discarding the other one that did not suit their agenda.
Those were the days. Get that, will you?
Of course, Gordon. Oh.
But it also takes a gifted writer to make such Han Solo-esque characters charming and likable rather than rude and off-putting, which they failed on so many levels with Bruce Wayne and Harvey Dent. Bruce was just not a likable character, but I'll say something to his credit later.
The situation's escalating and you're wasting my time, Pennyworth.
It appears, to me anyway, that the show is trying to replicate that approach of flat and almost one-dimensional characters, but they were just not able to make them compelling. That is ultimately why the show felt boring to a lot of people. There wasn't enough in there to attach you to any of the characters, and therefore you did not care where their stories were going. Comic books like The Hollywood Detective and games like LA Noire all had events reminiscent of the Clayface episode, but with vastly superior results because they had better written characters who inspired your curiosity or some type of emotion, so much so that you wanted to know where their stories would end. When you make choices with characters that are a departure from the norm, a good writer will usually have genuine reasons for those choices. Samuel L. Jackson, Nick Fury, as created in the Ultimates comics, is a notable choice. He is a very specific take on a pre-existing character because he brings a lot of charisma and new energy to the original character, who was quite bland in comparison. Bruce Timm said that the decision to gender swap the Penguin was because Batman lacked good villains and needed more female villains. On its face, that is one of the most ridiculous statements. I only stop short of calling it dumb, but let's play along. While they were planning the show, he proposed gender flipping the Penguin and supposedly a flood of ideas followed. This idea was apparently the spark that ignited their creative flames and set the writers' minds ablaze. Now let's explore those ideas based on what the show gave us. Oswaldo, as depicted on the show, is a scary mob boss who walks the line between entertaining the elite at her lounge as her public face, but also services the underworld in the shadows in private. Like an anti-Batman, if you will, and I really do mean anti-Batman because Oswaldo was dumb as rocks. The episode opens with the implication that she offs one of her henchmen with no proof, and then sends her favorite son swimming with the fishes, also with no proof, because she thinks they were selling her out. She was not even portrayed as nervous or paranoid or unhinged to lend credence to her actions, but she just made decisive decisions based on unfounded hunches. This made me wonder how she got into her prominent position to begin with. And as a clearly unattractive person with barely any charisma, they didn't bother to explain either why she was so popular among all the men at her lounge. The episode then ends with her blowing up the GCPD because that is the next logical step for a ruthless, calculating undercover mob boss who was supposed to be a secret threat to the city. It was impossible to take anything she did seriously because her actions were so illogical. In order to silence her son, who was about to rat her out to the police, she dismissed her henchman's good proposal to have one of the dirty cops silence him and decided to blow up the police station instead.
Let me have one of the insiders take care of it. Keep it quiet.
No.
it's too late for quiet.
And her son could dare call her a criminal genius.
The woman is a criminal genius. She's been running rings around you guys for months.
Like seriously, what was the end goal here? Instead of discrediting her son and hiding the evidence of her secret operations, which she had seemingly built up for years, she decided instead to blow up the whole operation on a whim and become one of the most wanted criminals. How did such an impulsive and irrational person operate under the noses of the police for that long?
I've been piecing together the full extent of Penguin's empire.
Former empire, you mean?
Yes.
And nothing about her relationship with her sons felt believable in the slightest. It's quite a wonder that they survived to adulthood with how easily she disposed of them. This whole episode was just ridiculous, and it only works in a world where you're not supposed to think of the events preceding it. That's probably why it was the first episode. So where would you rank this character among Batman's rogues? Because according to Bruce Timm, she was created to fill a perceived gap. Based on the inspiration for the gender swap, she should shoot to the top of Batman's rogues, but as it stands, she cannot even polish Kite Man's boots. She's just a glorified stereotype from Michael Bay's earlier films.
Or my money.
I love that there's a lot more female leads nowadays. I think that's so special, but we should have our own. I don't like it when it's like a spin-off. Like, I don't want to see like Jamie Bond, I want to see just like another badass. Yeah. So yeah, something like that, definitely.
But it's the middle of the night and I'm tired, so let's speed run through the other choices. Barbara Gordon, who was unrecognizable as the character, was just an angry black woman from her first appearance to her last. Talk about leaning on negative stereotypes. I very quickly grew tired of her character, and her father was one of the most boring depictions of the black police boss trope that I have ever seen. Literally did not add anything to Jim Gordon and arguably even took away from him with how boring and ineffectual he was. The argumentative dynamic he had with Barbara later on was also exhausting. I was so over these two characters by the time I was done with the show. Terrible creative decisions on both their parts. And speaking of stereotypes, Renee Montoya was also just a butch and angry lesbian with no growth or change throughout the show. Arnold Flass and Harvey Bullock were cartoonishly corrupt cops, and Harvey Dent, who was supposed to save the city, was smarmy and corrupt long before he turned into Two-Face. So he was actually two-faced before the attack that turned him into Two-Face. And Alfred's design was a choice. I have no idea why they changed his appearance because it added nothing. In isolation, any one of these decisions could be ignored, but cumulatively they painted a picture of very compromised storytelling. There was a very clear plan here to buck the system and use the popularity of Batman to satiate the writer's sociopolitical views, but what they ultimately did was create a show where you did not want to follow any of the characters, and especially the side characters who were given so much prominence. Catwoman, who I've seen people praising online as the one faithful depiction of the character, came across to me as a literal child. She had one demeanor through every situation, constantly smiling and not recognizing the gravity or the consequences of anything that was happening around her. She seemed cartoonishly oblivious to the ramifications of her actions.
Nice car.
And yes, I am aware that I've been criticizing cartoon characters as cartoonish. Now, Harleen Quinzel was a very interesting decision. In a show where there were so many one-dimensional characters, she was the main person who pulled me out of it. Yes, her being stocky and Asian and not blonde added nothing to the character either, just like the rest of the characters I just discussed. But I've never seen a more transparent and shameless mouthpiece for the writer's personal views than I did when hearing Harley's dialogue. She sounded exactly like the writer's room workshopping their perceptions of Batman, which were then Frankensteined into the dialogue that was given to the character.
This whole life that you've built for yourself, it feels so, I don't know, obvious. Almost a cliche.
She was somehow able to dissect Bruce Wayne and Batman on their first meeting in ways that only Alfred should have been able to do because he has known him since childhood, as if she had powers of omniscience, which she basically did because she was the mouthpiece for the writers. She sounded like J.J. Abrams preaching feminism and destroying patriarchal capitalistic wealth structures while being a rich white man himself. But who am I kidding? J.J. probably sees himself as one of the good rich whites. Okay, let's pull back because we're getting very negative. This is all opinion because this character upset me quite a bit and I'm not being objective right now. A line in one of the episodes even suggested that Harley knew Bruce and Batman were one and the same.
Maybe it's a way to shield yourself from further pain. It would be understandable if it was. That's a hell of a thing to go through as a kid.
Maybe next time we can unpack some of that childhood trauma.
Just based on how unbelievable she was as a character, she was the most offensive to me, even more than that dumb penguin gender swap. I have a lot more to say, but it's late and I'm giving this way more attention than I intended. I'll just wrap this up with my quick thoughts on Batman. I found him very unlikable as Bruce Wayne, as I mentioned earlier, but I did say I would add to that opinion. He was very flawed as a civilian, and there was this narrative that Bruce is the mask and Batman is who he really is. But on this show, I would have a hard time believing that Bruce Wayne is not who he really is. He felt entitled, spoiled, and out of touch.
Have you seen two girls around here? One has a blonde ponytail, the other...
Why are you looking for two little girls?
Huh?
And his interactions with Alfred and Harvey Dent proved to me that that is who he really was. What I will add to that opinion is, the end of the season seemed to indicate that all his rough edges were just Bruce going through an arc. We were watching him deal with his past trauma in real time, and because growth is usually uncomfortable, he didn't exactly come out in the best light, but it looked like he was supposed to become a better man in future based on his last interaction with Alfred.
Thank you, Penny. Alfred. Thanks, Alfred.
Special mention to all the random cameos in episode 8 with the Robins and Killer Croc, and for the 7th episode I will not shout out Onomatopoeia because I find him an extremely dumb character, even more so after seeing him here, but the show had so much promise if it wasn't sabotaged by the creative team's politics. This was clearly a show made by committee if I ever saw one. There are so many competing ideas and agendas that betray the lack of a singular vision that Batman the Animated Series had. Which is such a shame because as dumb, boring and illogical as a lot of it was, there was so much good in there that could have made this show one for the ages. That said, I am tired, both physically and mentally. I keep allowing myself to give these modern shows a chance when they lie to me with their trailers, and I almost always get burned in the end. I don't even know how to wrap this up because I really didn't want to make this video and it has gone so long. But let me know how you feel about the show and I will see you in the next one. Peace.
You have toys?